The date is January 19th, 1997. The Alamodome in San Antonio vibrates with the roar of 60,000 voices, a sea of humanity compressed into a cathedral of steel and anticipation. The moment hangs in the air like electricity before a storm. Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid, stands victorious in the ring, his body glistening with sweat beneath the unforgiving glare of the lights. Above him, the championship belt is raised, his second reign, his coronation as the face of the Federation. He has just vanquished Psycho Sid in a match that will be remembered as the moment when Shawn Michaels became not just a superstar, but the undisputed dominant force of professional wrestling's new era. The crowd erupts, the cameras flash, the announcers scream themselves hoarse. This is his kingdom now. This is his moment of absolute triumph. And yet, as that championship glints in those arena lights, there exists a darkness lurking just beneath the surface of this triumphant scene. Because while the fans cheered and the roar filled the Alamodome, something far more sinister was brewing in the locker rooms, the hallways, and the hotels of professional wrestling. While Shawn Michaels stood atop the mountain as the greatest in-ring performer of his generation, he was simultaneously the most hated man in the industry. Not hated as a villain deserves to be hated. That is theater, that is the business. No, Shawn Michaels was hated for real. He was despised, genuinely, viscerally, with a burning intensity that transcended the boundaries between performance and reality. Wrestlers who had trained their entire lives, who had sacrificed everything for this business, would speak his name with venom. Some of them harbored such contempt that they genuinely could not stand to be in the same room with him. This was not kayfabe. This was not performance. This was authentic, bone-deep hatred born from years of accumulated grievances, backstabbing, and the abuse of power. This is the paradox that defines Shawn Michaels' legacy during this era. A man at the absolute zenith of athletic achievement, yet simultaneously an outcast among his peers, a figure so reviled that his very presence in a locker room could create tension thick enough to cut with a knife. How did this happen? How did the greatest performer of his era become the most hated? To understand this enigma, we must go back to the beginning, to trace the arc of a career that would ascend to heights of glory while simultaneously descending into a personal nightmare of his own making. Shawn Michaels did not arrive in the World Wrestling Federation as a villain despised by his contemporaries. He came as a hungry, talented young wrestler possessed of a rare combination of athletic ability, charisma, and an intuitive understanding of crowd psychology that separated him from his peers. But something happened on the way to superstardom. Perhaps it was the speed of his ascension. Perhaps it was the nature of the business itself, which had begun to change in profound ways as the territorial system collapsed and all the talent concentrated in one company. Or perhaps it was simply that success revealed something in Shawn Michaels' character that had always been lurking beneath the surface. A ruthlessness, an ego, and a willingness to do whatever it took to maintain his position at the top. Consequences be damned. By the mid-1990s, Shawn Michaels had aligned himself with a faction known as the Kliq, a group of wrestlers, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Triple H among them, who wielded an almost unprecedented level of backstage power. This group did not simply influence the creative direction of the company, they controlled it. They made decisions that affected the careers of every other wrestler in the Federation. They determined who would win matches, who would be pushed, who would be buried, and who would be discarded. Bam Bam Bigelow would later describe those days as the darkest in company history, claiming that the Kliq had no respect for anyone, that they would toy with people and ruin so many lives without remorse or hesitation. Bret Hart, the embodiment of technical excellence and fierce professionalism, found himself repeatedly at odds with Michaels. Their rivalry was legendary, born from fundamental philosophical differences about what professional wrestling should be. Hart believed in respect, in paying dues, in the traditions that had built this business. Michaels believed in innovation, in pushing boundaries, in doing whatever it took to make himself the biggest star possible. But the professional rivalry metastasized into something far more personal and far more cruel. Michaels, with his sharp tongue and his complete lack of boundaries, crossed lines that should not be crossed. He made public insinuations about Hart's personal life on live television. suggesting improprieties that had no place in professional discourse. The tension between them became so thick that it seemed inevitable that their conflict would end in violence or permanent estrangement. Yet it was not just Hart who suffered from Michaels' barbs and his control of the narrative. Many others felt the sting of his words and the weight of his backstage influence. The Rock, a rising star possessed of a charisma and popularity that seemed to transcend the wrestling world itself and threatened to eclipse everyone around him, found himself in Michaels' crosshairs. According to accounts from those who were there, accounts from Bret Hart himself, Michaels and his allies viewed The Rock's ascent with something approaching envy and fear. They did everything they could to derail his momentum, to prevent him from becoming the mega superstar that his talent and charisma clearly destined him to be. They attempted to strip him of titles and hand them to other wrestlers. The Rock never forgot this. He never forgave Michaels for comments made about his family, particularly about his grandmother. For years afterward, The Rock would refuse to work with Michaels. His disdain a public rebuke that spoke volumes about how he viewed the Heartbreak Kid's character and his priorities. But The Rock's experience, while significant, was merely one chapter in a much longer and darker story. Shane Douglas, a talented wrestler who was caught in the machinery of the Kliq's influence, watched as his career stalled and ultimately collapsed under the weight of backstage politics. He came to believe that Michaels had actively sabotaged his opportunities, using his power to ensure that Douglas would never rise above mid-card status. Chris Candido, another wrestler who fell victim to the Kliq's machinations, developed heat with Michaels that would ultimately drive him away from the company entirely. The honky-tonk man, observing from the sidelines, came to view Michaels as a charlatan who had only survived due to his status as Vince McMahon's favored boy toy. A man who would fake injuries to avoid doing jobs to wrestlers he deemed beneath his status. Perhaps most telling was the reaction of The Undertaker, a man respected throughout the industry for his professionalism and his willingness to put over talent regardless of the circumstances. Even Undertaker, a wrestler known for his even temperament and his fairness, came to despise Michaels. As the years progressed and Michaels' attitude became increasingly erratic, fueled by the demons of drug addiction and the corruption of power that comes from wielding backstage influence over the careers and livelihoods of others, Undertaker reached a breaking point. He began to openly question Michaels' reliability and his character. He admitted that he harbored such contempt for him that he would have stood aside while others inflicted violence upon him. He would later threaten to tape his fists and beat Michaels senseless if he did not do the right thing in his match. Only later, after Michaels found religion and fundamentally transformed himself as a human being, would Undertaker and Michaels develop a genuine friendship. But that friendship was built on an entirely different foundation, on a Shawn Michaels who was no longer the man he had been in those wild mid-1990s. Then there was Marty Jannetty, Michaels' own tag team partner, his friend from the Rockers era. Their real-life fight became the stuff of wrestling lore, a physical altercation that represented something far deeper than a mere disagreement between colleagues. It was the visible manifestation of all the resentment that had been building, all the feelings of betrayal and disrespect that Jannetty harbored towards someone who had once been his closest ally in the business. After that fight, something broke between them that could never quite be repaired. Jannetty's career never recovered from the split, and the wound would never truly heal. Even wrestlers like Shane Helms, who had idolized Michaels as a child, discovered that meeting your hero is not always the joyful experience you imagine it will be. Helms came to believe that Michaels resented the very admiration that Helms had harbored for him. Rather than being pleased or grateful for the respect, Michaels seemed to view it with contempt. Helms would later claim that it took everything within him not to strike Michaels during various situations, with only the fear of jeopardizing his push preventing him from acting on his rage. Helms even dismissed Michaels' sudden newfound religion as nothing more than a calculated work, a performance dressed up as faith. And then there was Kurt Angle, who got into a physical altercation with Michaels backstage after Michaels began overselling his offense in an attempt to make Angle look foolish. The fight ended with Angle coming out on top, throwing Michaels around and asserting his own credibility. Jim Cornette, a veteran of the business, looked at Michaels with disdain. Cornette recalled Michaels as being one of the most unprofessional wrestlers of all time, a man who had no respect for anyone, even those who had helped build his career. Cornette claimed that the only reason Michaels eventually found God and transformed himself was because he had no one else to turn to, no friends, no allies, and no one who would stand by him. As we revisit January 1997, looking at Shawn Michaels holding that championship aloft in San Antonio, we see a man who has achieved everything that a wrestler could possibly achieve. He has the belt, the fame, the adulation of the fans, and the creative control to make whatever matches and storylines he desires. And yet he is also a man who has created an ocean of bad blood behind the scenes of professional wrestling. The question that haunts this moment, that shadows this victory, is whether such success achieved through such methods, whether such dominance built on the resentment and hatred of one's peers, can ultimately be sustained. The answer would come soon enough. But on this night, in this moment, Shawn Michaels stands at the apex of his power, unaware that the foundations of his kingdom are already beginning to crumble, and that the very people he has stepped on and disrespected are waiting for their moment of reckoning.